All right, we'll get started here in just a few minutes. We're going to let some people get logged in. So we'll just hang out for just a couple minutes. People will get logged in. I see we have a lot of questions already. My name is Greg Undo. I'm presenting from outside Washington, D.C. area in the United States. And how this Hangout will work is, I'm just going to do a quick audio test before we get into explanations. Okay, so how the Hangout works is we've had people that have submitted questions in advance by email to clubcubase@steinberg.de. And if people that are getting logged into the Hangout, if you're watching this live, it will be rebroadcast and indexed. If you are watching it live, you can feel free to introduce yourself in the comments field. Tell us where you're from in the chat field. And if you have questions, I see we have a number of questions already. You could ask your questions in the chat field. It's not necessary to ask your question repeatedly. We'll try to get through as many questions as possible in order. So if you ask the same question, 30 times in the chat field, it doesn't really help anyone. It's not going to get the question answered any faster. We'll try to get through them in order and answer as many questions as completely and as succinctly as possible. So, like many of you, during the time when many of us are staying home with the health crisis, my family is at home. So my son is at home. He's now watching, I think, an Egypt archaeology series. So we will probably get interrupted at some point. I'll apologize in advance. And I have home construction going on right next to me. So you may hear some noise from that. And my wife is also working directly above me. So I'll go ahead and apologize for that. But we'll let people get logged in. And if you're watching this, on a rebroadcast, you may want to fast forward to 8 or 10 minutes. And that's usually by the time everyone gets logged in and we have questions kind of collected. But we'll kind of get started in just a little bit. Thanks to everyone for being on the Hangout. All right, so we have lots of questions already submitted. That's great. Okay, so we'll just see. Okay, so we see Robbie from Dallas. Okay, so let's see if so seeing requests for some macros. All right, so we have Youngstown, Ohio, and I'm assuming Yotown is Youngstown. I've been there before. Okay, so we have Millard Brown wishing me a happy Cinco de Mayo. It's also my wife's birthday, so after the Hangout, I have to go out and we're doing our first kind of takeout dinner in 2 months or so. So it's in addition to Cinco de Mayo, so Mexico is nice enough, or America is nice enough to have kind of a holiday with Mexican themes for her birthday. Okay, so we see Wisconsin. I know Millard is from Pennsylvania. We also have Hampshire, Belgium. Good to see Taylor from Pine Grove, Pennsylvania. All right, we have India, Robbie from Dallas, Connecticut, Helena, Montana. That's great. I was going to be doing a trip to Montana this upcoming summer for the first time. I've never been. I was looking forward to it, but the conference got canceled. Okay, we'll just keep going. We have more people getting logged in. Thanks for everyone's patience. Okay, so it's just... All right, so we have Sweden, Finland, Oregon. So we have Greg McCarty, kind of a long-time Club Cubase Hangout attendee. It's good to see you, Greg. Brooklyn, Vancouver, UK. Okay, just reading through some of the questions coming in. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. All right, so we have West Virginia, probably not terribly far from me, next state over. All right, so just gone through lots of people getting logged in. All right, so we have Maryland checking in. Okay, seeing a suggestion for drag and drop inserts. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. All right, so we have Germany, Canada, India, Austria, Austin. Seems like the last three hangouts we've had Austin and Austria check in right next to each other. All right, we have Connecticut. Okay, from UK. Seeing nice wishes for my wife's birthday. Thank you. All right, we have France. All right, so we have Don Moffat. Good to see you, Don. Sorry we're missing you in New York for our normal Club Cubase. All right, so we have Cleveland. Good to see Roger Hooper. Great composer. Okay. Okay, so more people are getting logged in. We'll get started here in a couple minutes. You may hear my son playing an acoustic guitar outside, so. All right, so we have Houston checking in. Okay, just seeing some questions. Looks like we'll have some good questions for our discussion today. All right, some more people getting logged in. Maybe give it another 90 seconds or so. Okay, so, and again, for those people just that are just getting logged in, if you want to introduce yourself, and you can leave questions in the comments field. I say I got a really great shout out from Chris and Dom. They did a hangout yesterday. I watched a couple minutes of it, but I'll have to check it out tonight. But yeah, those are great guys. It was great. We got to spend some time at NAMM together. So, all right, good to see Dave Glick on the hangout. He usually comes to our Washington D.C. All right, so we have Dave Glick and Roger on the hangout. Usually attend our in-person hangouts or Club Cubase meetings in Washington. All right, a couple more people getting logged in. Okay, so I'll just kind of go up to the very top, and we had someone who just discovered Hangouts and asked a whole slew of questions. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for all the great questions. I hope everyone learns a tip or trick. So we had a question: is there a way to conform MIDI notes to a specific scale key as you record them in live, so you don't have to record wrong notes and automatically moves it to a correct one? And so if we wanted to come here, we have what we call an input transformer. So on a MIDI or instrument track, let's see if I can adjust my mic stand. I know sometimes it's squeaky and annoying sounding. But we have this little squiggly line here, and we could just set this to be global or for local, and local could be for a very specific, for that very specific track. And one of the things you want to do that's a little counterintuitive is make sure that you have the module open. And what this will do is we could actually say transform, or we could say filter out. Either would work for this. And we want to say at the top, we want to define what we want to filter out, or what we want to filter, or we can say transform, and how we want to transform it at the bottom. So I can say we want to take our events that are equal to notes, and just by hitting the plus sign, we do that. And we're going to say for value 1, we can now say transpose to scale. And we could say I wanted this to be an E minor, melodic minor, E pentatonic scale. So you could set your scale directly here. So you can say, okay, now I want, and now what this will do is any notes that come in, it will just transform them to be directly within your E major scale. So you could do that. Okay, question. And let me just make sure I'm at the very top. It says, hi, Greg. I found a nice jazzy vocal guitar piece on my hard drive. I'd like to put it into a groove, but unfortunately it has a bit of a tempo drift. Can I splice up the waves and snap them to a grid? So let's say if we have something like that, I will just take a particular project here. And one of the cool things we could do is some tempo detection. Let me see. I may have this in my recent projects still. Okay. So if I wanted to come here, and let's say I have a jazz piece here, and it's not lined to the click. So what I could do is I'm going to just select the file here. And I'll just put a little EQ on it to kind of. So this isn't aligned to the click that's going on. So what we could do is just go to your project menu, and we'll go to tempo detection, and I'll say active or analyze. We'll click on analyze here, and this could be for an entire piece or just like an audio snippet. And we do this, it's on the offbeat, so there's offbeat correction. So once I've done that, if I wanted to straighten this up, all I would have to do is select that file. And when we do this, we could see our, when we go to our sample editor here at the bottom, we could see, we're going to have our measures now aligned, and it places it at a measure of, it figures it out by the beat. So we may want to just, that's probably the downbeat right there where the kick drum comes in. So I will just make sure I have snap enabled, which is J, and then I'll just put in my 4/4 beat there. So now I have the grid following the music. And if I wanted to make the music kind of follow the grid, one of the things you could do, and you can kind of treat this both ways, which is nice. If you go to the audio menu to advanced, we could say set definition from tempo. And then as we do this, we could say I want it to save in the project. And this is going to basically embed the tempo changes of every single track, every single beat into the audio file itself. So if I wanted to just change my tempo here to a perfect 120 beats a minute, every single beat will just change. So if I say, let's make this 156. Or 189. So now it's playing back perfectly in time, but if I wanted to extract the groove of this, I could activate the tempo track here. And once I go into the sample editor by double clicking, we could just go to your hit points and kind of find the rhythmically significant points of the file. So I could just say, let's do an analysis of this. And if I really like that one particular groove, we could now click on the hit point editor where we could just say make groove. And what this is going to do is now it's automatically placed a groove into our quantize presets. So I could apply the feel of this track to other MIDI or other audio performances as well. So that way you can make a groove out of it, even if it does have tempo changes, and you could still kind of regulate it. So before doing that, if you're worried about the regulation of the tempo, just set it to one steady tempo value and extract the groove, and then you could apply it and work with that particular file. Okay, so just make sure going through. Thanks for all the great questions from everyone. Okay. Okay, so it says, hello, Greg. My question is how to reset my MIDI keyboard controller in Cubase 10.5 Pro. I updated keyboard firmware, and now MIDI keyboard doesn't work. Please explain setting up external MIDI controller. When you're dealing with MIDI controllers on Mac or PC, it's really contingent on if the computer operating system sees it, Cubase will see it. So it's kind of an operating system level. So if you did a function, you should be able to, like when you add a MIDI track, you should be able to just have, all of your available inputs and outputs listed here for your devices. So if you don't see your device listed here, that could be indicative that maybe it's not being seen by the operating system. So you may want to go into your control panel and under sound video gain controllers on the Windows platform, or under Mac if you go to applications, utilities, to audio MIDI setup to make sure it's there. You could also have Cubase filter particular controllers. So if we want it to go to your studio setup under your studio menu and then click on your MIDI port setup, you should see it listed here. So if you want it to, could be perhaps maybe it was hidden by accident. So you could just pick and choose which MIDI devices are visible. But if you don't see it listed here, that would mean that it's not being seen by your operating system and Cubase can't access it. So check to see if it's being seen at your operating system level, and make sure that your firmware update for your controller, actually kind of took and, was successful in upgrading. Okay, so this is probably a further question. Also, how to set up external keyboard slider controller with mixer volume slider, not VST volume slider. Thank you, Greg. So there's a couple of different ways of doing this. One is you could have, you could do it as a generic remote. So, and, you could set up your inputs and outputs here for your controller. And you could just, say, I want this particular controller to do this particular function. So this could be, transport control, or you could say, I just wanted to go to my VST mixer, and we'll say device, and, we could say, or I'll just start with the default so you can see exactly what it does here. So we'll just kind of click on the plus sign here and go to generic remote. And then you're able to, say I wanted this to be my VST mixer. I want it, this to be particular channel. So you could say, I want this incoming MIDI message to be transmitted out to this particular parameter. And when you kind of start this, it'll actually I'll just add another one here. I think it'll just kind of see that we'll have the track name here, but you'll just see kind of the volume faders. Now, if you wanted to assign your particular function, you could just say, okay, I want this, and try not to choose all MIDI inputs, but you can say, okay, like I have a Nectar controller here. I want to learn. So click the learn and move a knob. And that will automatically control that as through our generic remote. And if I have it kind of set up correctly, we can now just look at it. And that is controlling the output as soon as I move my VST fader on my controller. Now there's also, you could do this similar concepts for track quick controls. And what track quick controls could allow you to do is once we go to our studio setup again, you'll see track quick controls. And then for a particular channel that's selected, we could go to your quick controls here, and there's different presets. So if you say, okay, I want this to be my volume, sorry, I have my computer resting on top, but you could, do the learn function in the same way. And now you could just move your sliders here directly and control your quick controls. And these could be really for, nearly any parameter that you would want to do. So you select the channel and you can say, I want this to do, gain. I want it to do, panning, volume, so really just about any particular parameter there. So those are some ways you can get your MIDI controller controlling different aspects of your in Cubase. Okay, so we'll move on. Okay, and I thought I saw questions earlier, maybe they kind of fell off, if, you could do very audio editing in the lower zone. In the mix console, we had a question, can you do, mix, hit points in the lower zone? So, so that was a question that was mailed in. I may see it later. I just remembered it, but I thought it was before in the list that I'm reading. So you could definitely edit hit points. Another question we had is, can you do vary audio in the lower zone? So I'll just come over here and I'll just find a vocal.
Turn it up!
All right. Let me just turn that preview volume down just a little bit.
We're keeping it real, keeping it. You want to be me, I want to be you. Hands high, to the air, yeah.
Find something that's... So if we had a question is, can you do vary audio in the lower zone? So if you just come here, double click, that will make the lower zone into the current fader. And then you could just select vary audio here. And then you could do all of your vary audio editing. We had a question that was also submitted in kind of this range of questions of, can you adjust the pre? So when we go into like the mixer channel, so let's say if I have an audio channel here, click on the edit channel strip, you have this gain control here. So you could adjust the gain. So the question was how to get that gain control on the inspector on the left-hand side. So if we come here, we may notice that there's not a pre-section on the particular track. So if we go to like our channel strip, we're going to see kind of our different functions here for gates. But if we go to our track quick controls, this is where you could say, I want it to go to, my input filter, and then, At this point, you could have pre-gain and you could just adjust your gain from a slider there. So you could do, vari audio editing, hit point editing, and adjust your pre-gain kind of all from the same area. Okay, moving on. Thanks for all the great questions. Okay, so I see a question. Is Steinberg tech support only available by chat sessions currently, or is there a phone support yet to be able to hook up with TeamViewer for tech support during the stay at home? It really depends on your country. I believe that in the United States, our tech support guys, they're working from home, but they're still able to use TeamViewer and they're still taking phone calls as well as emails. So I think it really could depend on your country. So I'm not sure what Steinberg is doing in Germany, for support, and it kind of falls to different, different distributors and different countries will have different support mechanisms. So I'm not familiar with what the status is with all of them, but I'm pretty sure I know that our tech support guys have been calling people and doing team viewers for people during our stay home era, at least in the United States. So. Okay, so just upgrade to Cubase 10.5, having trouble with the real-time peak and with some sessions, not in all. MacBook Pro, 16 gig, 2.8 Intel i7. Any tips for improving performance? If you, make sure that, the first thing to always check if you're noticing some CPU usage is to, try raising the buffer. So if we go to your studio menu to studio setup, and we look at our Steinberg interface here, you want to just simply come over here and try raising the buffer is the first thing to do. Sometimes and it could really depend on, the use, sometimes people, they're doing large composer templates where they may have 3,000 tracks going on, may run into scenarios where, they find that kind of splitting, having more instances of the same instrument, even if it is multi-timbral, can, spread the load across, multiple cores easier, because if you have 16 instruments in one plugin, one instrument in another, and one instrument in another, those 16 instruments within that one plugin is going to be kind of utilizing one processing core more than, the same amount of processing power as is one instrument with one sound. So you can kind of allocate that. There's also, if you go to your studio setup, there's different settings where we could make sure that you have ASIO guard on. So that can make a big difference, and make sure that you have the multi-processing capability checked as well. But those are some things you could do to really kind of make sure that you're maximizing your CPU usage on your computer. Okay. It says, do you know if Steinberg Yamaha will come out with an audio interface that will have MIDI plugin channels? If not yet, may I recommend? I guess this is maybe an audio interface that has a hardware component on it for maybe generating sounds. So if that's what your question is, I'm not sure what you mean by MIDI plugin channels. But I've requested that myself, but I will, pass it on to our hardware teams in Japan as well. So to see if they could, to reiterate that. But yeah, I've asked for that same feature if I think is what you're asking for. All right, question. Can you make a macro so that when you finished recording, the cursor jumps back to the start and turns off the punch in so that you can press play and audition what you just recorded? Okay, so let's see. Okay, so this could be determined on, a preference. So one of the preferences, and this trips people up a lot, I did a whole video dedicated to this. If you go to the transport, there is a option here for return to start position on stop. So now if I'm recording something, and let's say I have this track armed, then now when I hit stop, it goes right back to where I played. Okay, so that's one part of the equation. So let's say, okay, so let's say we had a punch in set. All right, so I'll just see if we can create the condition as described. So I'll just set my left locator here, and let's say my right locator here. So let's say I hit I and O for my punch in, or we could do this on a transport. So as soon as I come here, we'll punch in. Okay, so and they just wanted to audition without recording that again. So if you wanted to make a macro, so let's say we have punch in and punch out selected, I could just come right over here. So to make a macro, and a macro is a series of keyboard shortcuts. So if we want to go to the key commands here, I'll say new macro. And we'll say disable punch in. And then what I want to do is I will just come over here and let me just check. So I will go to my transport and we will just choose activate punch in, and we're going to add this command and activate punch out. And add that command. I think that will just toggle the behavior of that. So let's come over here and I will, and then if you wanted to, you could automatically, within this macro, just hit play. So we could include that. So let's go to our So if you hit the key command here, that will, if you know what the key command is, that will just automatically tell you where and what the name is of the key command. So we'll just say transport. And then we'll just get a start stop. Okay, so let's say I now just have this set up. I have punch in and punch out active. I will just hit play. It's going to punch. All right, so now what I do is just simply activate this macro, and we'll say disable punch in. So let me just see if I had made a mistake with that really quickly. So here I'm just going to say start stop and then click add here. Okay, so the macro would just be for disable punch in and listen. You could call it whatever you want. I'm just going to activate punch in, activate punch out, and then play. So as soon as I wanted to get rid of this, we'll hit play. and I'm going to activate the punch in and punch out first before. Now let's go ahead and trigger that macro, disable punch in. Then that will automatically trigger it to play, and you could audition what you just punched if you wanted to. So once again, if you go to key commands, we can now just go, and these are the 3 steps that I would do to approach that macro. Okay, so I'm just seeing hi Greg from Youngstown, Ohio. I still need a direction for separating a drum audio into kick track and snare, etc. So, there isn't, I've seen some tools that, attempt to take like a full mixed down track, like a stereo loop and break it down into kick and snare, but I haven't really seen any that can do complex stuff very well. So I know what some people can do, is take a drum loop, and let's just jump back to a project with a quick drum loop here. So let's say if I have this particular drum loop, I know some people will kind of fake it a bit and do transients kind of based upon like applying an EQ to it. So if you come here, we could say, if I want it. So, we'll go ahead and just take a look at this, and one of the things that you could do is, just drag it into Groove Agent. You could take a multi-track file very easily and, find the transients for it. But a lot of times if you have like a hi-hat going on at the same time as the snare, as the kick, those don't get picked up well. So what I've seen some people do to try to like deconstruct a loop is to just apply EQs to it. So let's say if I just wanted to go to my processes, or we could just run it through a plugin, and let's just do a little bit of, we'll just choose like the studio EQ. And then they'll just kind of come over here and just like really boost the low end and cut all highs. So now when they play it back, that you could just have that, and then do, as you do this, at that point, do a hit point detection. So once you have the hit points determined, you could kind of carve out different frequencies like that. But Cubase doesn't have anything particularly that will allow you to just automatically, deconstruct a stereo audio file. And I haven't really seen anything that really will do it well for a number of different projects. So, but if it's on a multi-track, you could do it quite easily. So, but if I misunderstood your question, Brian, just let me know. All right. Okay, so let's go through some more questions. Okay, it says, when I try to fix an event to be quantized on the line, it does not do that, but the back of the end of it is aligned perfectly in time. So I'm not sure if this question is for MIDI or audio. So maybe if you could specify and what you mean by quantize on the line. I assume that's the grid. So, if we have just show you maybe like this audio example here. So if I wanted to, we'll just put this on in like this on a track, and we'll go ahead and solo this track. All right. Not hearing that for some reason. All right, let me just do a new project here. Okay, so let me just go ahead and find a beat, something here real quick. Sorry. Okay, so just erase this. So, I'm not sure if the question is for audio or MIDI, but, if you wanted to take something like that, and let's go to our hit point editor. So if we double click and then select our hit points here, you can find kind of the rhythmically significant points of the loop. And now at this point, you can say, I want to quantize it to, let's say, eighth notes. And then, once we've split the slices, so I'll just, again, come here. Let's create slices. And now this will turn into a part. And now I can just say, let's go ahead and quantize. And now, so you could do different quantizing, but I'm not sure maybe if you could specify if that is going to be for, for audio or MIDI, that would be helpful. All right, we'll move on. Okay, just going through, we're still going through some introductions here. Okay, so we have a question. What is the function of group faders after you have made your balanced static mix using the individual faders? At what stage is it critical to use group faders to your mix or to your advantage? A lot of times, when people use groups, and, some people, do tons of work with groups, and some people, tend not to use them and treat everything independently. So it could be very convenient for like, okay, I wanted to have all of my drums in this example. And I liked the balance that I had here of my drums, that, instead of moving the individual faders or linking them, that we could just add a group channel to the selected channels, and we'll make this a stereo group. So as I do this, I could adjust the volume of all those tracks simultaneously by moving one fader. And this also allows you to do processing on this as well. So if I want to take all of my drums as one collective entity or background vocals, I could just do my processing on one particular group. And if you get into also doing some parallel processing, so let's say if I come right over here, we add a group channel, we could just select these, and let's go to my sends, and I wanted to send these all to group 2 as well, and I will turn that on. We can now kind of do a parallel processing where it's going to go to both group tracks. And what I could do is just come right here, and I'll go to my channel strip, and let's just do like a really heavy compression. So I could take my drums and have one group that's unaffected and one that's really squashed. And kind of blend those two. So that's another way when people use groups. So, but there's plenty of people that don't use groups, and I see. I think I mentioned in the last hangout that I was once on Michael Wagner project in Nashville, where he had 12 different kick drum mics and like 8 snare mics going on. So he would group his kicks and group his snares, and then group his drums and group that in with percussion. So you could have nested groups within groups. So. So really, there's no perfect set stage of when you could actually, when to use groups, but a lot of people will use it kind of during the mixing process. So. Okay, so we had a question from Taylor. Can user patterns be saved in T-Guitar? I don't think so. I haven't tried. But I think that user patterns could be really hard to work with. So let's go ahead and take a quick look. And if you're not familiar with T-Guitar, this is it's not actually a Steinberg product, but I think it's done by Acoustic Instruments, but we're selling it on our website. So we'll go ahead and add a quick instrument track. And this could be run like in Halion Sonic SE. Just get this loaded up. And one of the cool things you can do with T-Guitar is it actually will have, different strumming patterns behind it. So as soon as I come over here to edit, we could play the individual notes. So if I play a chord here, we can hit these notes here. So I just hold down, let's say, an E minor chord. I could kind of strum it. And then I can hit these keys to kind of arpeggiate the chord. So you could, I'm a horrible keyboard player, but and then there's also, you could have a solo mode where but obviously when you play chords as a basic chord as a keyboard player, it's going to be voiced differently. So then how a guitar would voice it. So when we move this to the guitar, to chords, we could, as we hit a keyboard chord here, like just a straight block chord, it's going to voice the guitar. And then there's different patterns. And these are kind of pre-done. And I know it seems like it would be like really simple to drop your own user pattern in, but people probably have spent a long time coming up with these patterns. And, from being involved with other projects in the past, these aren't necessarily easy to come up with. So you could have different patterns on different keys. So if you just kind of click on a key here, you can say, I want this to be kind of like a folk pattern when I hit a C. So when I hit a D, I get one strumming pattern, and I hit a C. So if you really want it, and I know that once you get a plugin like this, you just, there's a lot of patterns to work with, but obviously you may want to come up with your own. And if you do that, you could just take MIDI and then just have like even the chord pads trigger different like guitar patterns and drag and drop patterns into that, and just put T guitar into its own solo mode. But I don't think you'll quite get the same effect as what, triggering, because they've actually recorded, the actual, guitar chords and how they represent, as opposed to the, just the individual MIDI notes that are being triggered. And that's why it sounds so realistic with the voicings. Okay. Okay. Okay, so it says, "Hi, Greg. Cheers from the Philippines. Great to have you on from the Philippines. I saw a video of you explaining Project Logical Editor and colorizing tracks. Can you expand for multiple tracks?" Yeah, so let's say, if I wanted to take, let's say I had naming conventions for tracks here. So I wanted to go, I'll show you two things with the Project Logical Editor that you could do. So I want to, in the Project Logical Editor, is kind of a Boolean, and we could think of it as a conditional editor. So I could say, let's see if I get this set up. So I'm going to say, let's just rename track. So I'm going to choose to transform, and we'll say container type equals track. And then what we want to do is, I think if we set property is set to event is selected, we could add, so let's say I wanted to append all the names of these tracks. I'll put in space drum. Okay, so if I did this right, we should rename all the selected tracks and put drum at the end. Okay, so that's an easy way of kind of organizing things with different naming conventions. But now I could say, if the name of the track, so I could say name contains drum. And then I will just come here and say set color to fixed value, and I'll say make it that color. So now I could say any track that has the word drum in the name for multiple tracks, just make it into that selected color. So that kind of gives you can set up like conditions like that for, very powerful aspects of the program, where, and it saves you a lot of like, oh, I don't want to necessarily do this 24 times and have 24 times the chance of making a mistake. So the logical editor could be used for stuff like that, for colorizing tracks. And so that's a good way of doing multiple tracks as well. Okay, so another question from Taylor. Can I monitor the right zone sample preview through a spectrum analyzer? Doesn't register through the stereo out. All right, so let's say if I come here, I think if we go to our media bay, so let's say we have our control room and we're auditioning different samples here. Okay, so I may not have like a appropriate plugin, but if we go to the control room and go to your inserts, you should be able to have. Okay, so let's say I have my multi-scope now. So I'm just putting this on my insert in the control room, and you can do that by clicking in the lower right-hand zone. And now let's see if I audition. Yeah, so you could just come there and audition. So you could just kind of come there and select. So once again, just kind of within the control room itself, within the, your monitor, just come over here to inserts, and you could just put in like the multi-scope there. And then you could, as you audition loops, you could see various scopes, and you can put any VST plugin really in there in the same way. So there's different metering plugin, very easy. Okay. Okay, so it says, I haven't heard any construction sounds during the Hangouts yet. And so they usually try to wrap up like around 1 for lunch, I think, so to get all their noisy stuff in early. So that's good. I hope it's not too distracting. So I could be hypersensitive, especially like when I'm doing tutorial videos. Sometimes we have planes flying overhead. We're not too far from the airport. So, okay, so question. Hey, Greg, is there a way to use the delete time function to cut out time from the project but not cut the video and tempo? Cuts everything in the locator range, but I don't want to cut video. So let me just open up a quick project. So you could treat it kind of globally. There's kind of a global selection, which would include that, but there's also where most people do it is not on a global level. So let me just open up my export video project. Thanks everyone for wonderful questions. If you've learned something new and interesting, please feel free to like the video and to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And we'll be doing these about twice a week. So if you have other questions, again, you could submit them. So let's say if I have my video here and I'm kind of playing along. So if I had like audio and MIDI all going on and I didn't want to affect the tempo, I would just select these different events with my range selection tool. And then you could just hit Control Shift X, I believe. So I'll just come here, Control Shift X. And then my tempo and my video isn't affected, but the selected tracks are. If you have the range selection tool and you double click between the locators, that would allow you to cut the tempo and the video. So if I just come here, I could just say it's Control Shift X, and that would cut the video and everything. But if I have just the tracks selected with my range selection tool here, so just use my range selection tool for the tracks, not selecting the video or the audio. I can now just come here, Control or Command Shift X, and that would delete. And you could also do that directly from the range tool. So if you just come here and just say cut time, boom. So it gives you the same function. So don't globally select everything, which is handy in a lot of cases where you do want to cut the video and tempo if there was an edit change. But if you wanted to maintain that, just simply use the range selection tool on the parts that you want to cut. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so at Cubase, suggestion for next Cubase, allow Media tab in right window and mixer screen to have FX section to see graphic of effects and drag and drop to inserts. So I see where you could do that like in the, I guess this is in the full mix console so that you could see your racks here to drag and drop. So, we could currently do this. And this is, where a lot of people really like this is the ability to, drag and drop different components when you open the wrong window, like I just did. Sorry. So I could just take, different tracks and add an effects channel track, or, you could drag it to a track and add inserts. But I will pass that along in my next discussions, where it would probably also make sense, and it's already done here, in the right zone of the mixer to see your effects and be able to drag and drop down it. That makes a lot of sense. So thanks again for reminding me of that. Okay, so we saw a question, can you show an easy way to accurately get the tempo of the full track? So I think we did that a little bit earlier with the jazz piece. All right. So again, you go to project and tempo detection. Okay, so we had a question. Hi, Adam here from Munich, Germany. I'm using Cubase AI9 I got with my Steinberg audio interface. I'm facing constant dropout issues within Windows 10 PC when using VST instruments. One thing to do is to, try adjusting your buffer size up. I know it's tempting at all times to just, have that great feel and run the latency super low. And when you run the latency super low, it makes the computer work really significantly harder when you do that. One other thing that it could be, so try raising your audio buffer, and that would probably help significantly. That will add more latency, but it will make your VST instruments, playable without dropouts. So there's always kind of a balance. One other thing that it could be is sometimes when you connect an audio interface, and I've run into this a lot, and this is a suggestion that's helped people, connecting it, and I'm on a Mac, so I can't really show this, but if you go into, a lot of times the PC motherboards can actually kind of throttle the power to the USB ports. And, obviously kind of a big benchmark that computers are using is to make sure that they're kind of green and eco, and, especially if it's a laptop, like they're their biggest priority is to have longer battery life. So sometimes what they do is they actually trigger like power suspension on the USB ports. So if you kind of, Google like how to disable power management on your USB port if the buffers don't work. I've seen that help people that have just had problems for years, and they do that, and it's like, oh wow, my USB audio interface just works amazingly great now. And it was because the power was being throttled to that particular port. So check those two things, and I think you'll be kind of up and running. Okay. Okay, so a question. It says, yesterday I was mixing. I had rendered all MIDI to audio, Groove Agent to audio too. I started to get pops and clicks from CPU, went to 100% and stayed 100%. Delay compensation seemed to help. One thing that you do is once you render your files, like let's say if I took this particular section here and I just did a quick render in place. So just go to my edit menu, and I'll just choose a really quick render in place for this. And I had someone, kind of a big R&B producer, called me this, like, yeah, I rendered everything, and then it was still like just totally killing my CPU. And I'm like, did you turn off the instrument after you rendered it? And he was like, oh, no. So once you have rendered a particular track, one of the things you could do is select the MIDI track, like the Groove Agent tracks if you want, and just choose to, you could turn the instrument off, or if you just disable the tracks, that way it's not going to actually send that data to the plugin. So that it's actually kind of turning off that plugin for rendering usage. So if you render something and you're still, and then you think, well, it's counterintuitive that it's actually you know, to the point where it's like, oh, we can't, you know, it's taking up more power after I render it. Why is it? It's because you could disable that. And one of the settings that you have in the render in place, it's a great, clever thing, is let's just come here and I'll enable the track and I'll undo the render in place. But if you come, you could actually just say, I wanted to do just render in place that particular section. And if you go to the render settings, you could choose to, if you have the track selected. So let's say if I come here, I'll select this track as opposed to an event. And we go to render in place. We could say render settings. You'll have the options to disable the source tracks. So at that point, you could just render, and then that would automatically disable the source tracks once it's done. So make sure that when you do the rendering, that, you know, those tracks become disabled. So that's something to kind of play around with as well. Okay. So, all right. So we have New Hampshire. All right. All right. So just going. Okay, so see a question. Hi, Greg. Is it possible to record chords from the circle of fifths, proximity process, or proximity screens, or are they only for populating the chord track? They're really kind of intended to be, you know, so when you go to the chord pads here or to the chord tracks, we could have different settings for proximity and circle of fifths. And this is really just kind of serving as more of a visual, you know, reminder of chords that could be related. And the intention is really just to kind of take those chords and drag it down to the chord pads, or when you're coming up with chord ideas. So, you know, when we want to come up with, let's say we have a chord track, and we start putting chords in. And we go to our chord suggestions. So let's look at our chord track here. So when we go to say, oh, what's a good chord to go, you know, from C to D in between, you could double click. And then when you go to the chord assistant here, it's also intended to give you kind of visual representations of those chords. So you could just select it and select a new chord from there for a track, but it's not really intended to be recorded per se, but just more as a musical suggestion or reference to chords that you may have like forgot of. Okay. Okay, so we see a question. So it's a question continued. So it says, what makes CPU jump to 100% and hang there? What does delay composition do to mix down? One of the things that you could do a lot of times, like, you know, that people, we see a lot of people that tend to try to, it's not always the best idea, but I understand why people do it, but is to try to almost master during their, as they're doing their tracking. So often they'll have like, you know, just limiters and like very powerful EQ plugins like frequency. So it's say, okay, I wanted a brick wall limiter, I wanted a maximizer, whatever. Dynamics here. So at this point, you could just say, you know, I wanted a, you know, multi-band compressor. So let's say you have like a whole effects chain. So people are often tend to work with like the effects chain process going on here throughout the whole project. And sometimes I find that you're almost kind of lying to yourself, where if you make it sound great without these, and then, you know, that you're kind of better off when you turn them on and the projects turn out a little better. But I know it's kind of a quick, dirty way to get to the finish line, per se, in your project. But what this could do is when we look at your mix console, it could, when we look at the delay compensation. So if you go to the upper right-hand corner to the setup window, we could actually see the channel latency. So adding those plugins is added 124 milliseconds of latency. So the multi-band compressor is 123. The brick wall limiter is 1 millisecond or 44 samples. So when people are tracking, sometimes they have like a whole huge effects chain here and they're tracking through that. So what the delay compensation would allow you to do is to kind of bypass some of those plugins that aren't critical for the particular channel, so that the latency can be minimized. So sometimes I'll get this question, people will go to their output channel and like, yeah, all of a sudden it's, my inserts are bypassed and I can't turn them on. And it's because we have the constrained delay compensation active. So that's kind of what it does. It's really more for during like playback and recording, but when you actually go to render a particular file, the plugins will still be included, but it allows you to have those plugins and still record with a minimal latency. And that's really kind of the intention. So it doesn't really affect the mix down, but that's kind of what's going on with constrained delay compensation. Okay. Moving on. Thanks for all the great questions. Says Greg, I'm unable to get signal on my input mic channel, but the sound can be heard from my monitors. So it could be, so if you're not, and it's hard to know exactly which interface. So some interfaces, when you're using them, can have built-in DSPs. Some of them could be set to a direct monitoring mode. So if it's set to direct monitoring mode, basically what that signal does is go directly from the input to the output. Like a lot of our audio interfaces, like our UR interfaces, have built-in DSP. And if they're not connected to the computer, and you have the EQ and the channel strip and the reverb set up in software, you disconnect it, those settings are maintained. And you could pass the recorded input signal directly to the output. So you could kind of check that. So one thing you could, is make sure that as you're working with an audio track, that you have the right input set. And the inputs can be kind of chosen from your studio menu audio connections. Make sure that you have your inputs for your devices selected, and that's configured where your microphone is connected to. Make sure that that input is the one that is selected in the top area here. And then make sure that, you have the monitor enable, and this will allow you to hear the signal. And that you also have the record enable. So if you don't have the monitor, and if you have record enable but not monitor, you could record the signal but not hear it. If this is on, you could hear it, but if you just have the monitor on, you could hear it, but the signal won't get recorded. So check those things. And this could all be contingent also when you go to the interface, on direct monitoring. So some of the interfaces will have direct monitoring and some won't. So you could, try toggling that. One of the preferences that I usually set up for people when they ask me to do like consulting for them is to make their life a little easier is if you go to the preferences is to switch kind of the auto monitoring style. So if we go to VST, I believe it's set to manual just to be kind of very conservative by default, but I always have people switch it to tape machine style. And that way, when a track is record enabled, it will be monitoring, and it kind of functions like a tape machine. So like when you punch in, you monitor, you're hearing the source from the track before, but when you punch in, you hear the recorded signal, and then you punch out, and then so the monitoring kind of works how a lot of people expect it would. So I would try those things if that's the case that you're running into. Okay, so it says Vargas from Houston. It's good to see people from Houston. My brother lives in Houston with his family. If we do offline processing, I noticed van edits, audio edits for nullified. Is there a way around it? I'm okay. So I think this is with Vary. I'm sorry. So I have a small screen that I read the questions on. Okay. So it says if we do offline processing, I noticed that Vary audio edits are nullified. Is there a way around it? So if you're doing a lot of Vary audio editing, so let me just open up project here with some vocals. So a lot of times when I start doing, if I'm doing a lot of vocal edits and, I need to do a lot of tuning, the first thing that I would do is just to duplicate the vocal track. So I'll leave one unaffected just in case, because there's obviously can be a lot of sensitivities to vocals from the vocalist. So I will just duplicate that particular track, leave that one completely intact, and I will select this. And even though these are sharing the same audio file, I've gotten to a point where I will just do kind of a bounce selection and then just choose to replace the file. So now I have my original file, and now I'm going to be just tuning and doing Vary audio on a file that's exactly the same, just in case we need to go back. So once we got into Vary audio, and again, we could do Vary audio in the lower zone, or, I often prefer to do it like just in a particular window. So as soon as I come here, I'll just get to my Vary audio tab again. And so now that we've done our Vary audio, if we're done and we're happy with all the tuning, and you wanted to do other processes, all you have to do is in the processes here is just choose to flatten. And at this point, we could just basically embed the tuning changes. And as we do this, I could still do other offline processes, but it's kind of just a static file. It's kind of playing back a file that's changing based upon your Vary audio edits. So now if I just wanted to come here and reverse this or normalize it, let's say I'll just reverse it. At that point, I'm not going to get those messages. So within the Vary audio editor, just try to, right under here, under functions, try to just flatten the file, and that should allow you to take care of it. So, but if you ever had to go back to the original, having that original file is always kind of a good thing. And if, you never need it again, just hide it, and, it won't bite you later by any chance. Okay. So it says, hello, I have one major issue with Cubase Pro 10.5 that's preventing me from using it as my main DAW. I like to start all of my songs from the first bar. Okay, so let me just see if there's more from that. Okay, so, if you want it to come here, so let's say if I select all of my events here, and let's say my song starts here. And I'll just turn on my snap. So let's just say, or not. So let's say I'll just snap those to the bar. So as soon as I come here, I think if we just go to your project setup, you could just say your display time offset. So at this point, we could so let's say if we look at this and I'll probably do this wrong, but you could just all right, and once you kind of do that, you could just say this is where measure 1 starts, and I think if we come here, but so if you play around with the offsets, you could do that, but you could also, I'll just do my display bar offset. That'll be even easier. So let's say, this starts at measure 89. So I could come here. And then you say that's where measure 1 is. So even though you have all this time before and after, so just go to your project setup, which you get access by hitting Shift S or going to your project setup. And then you'll see your display bar offset and just set the value there. And that way measure 1 could really kind of be anywhere you think. So if I'm misunderstanding your question, just let me know. But if you want to start all your songs, you could obviously move them to measure 1 if that's not the case. But you should be able, I think that should work for you. Okay. Let's move on. Thanks everyone for great questions. If you've learned a tip or trick, please feel free to give a thumbs up. Okay, so it says, hi Greg, on exporting audio to MIDI for a voice track, does Cubase include pitch bend CC messages to track subtle pitch variations of the performance? Yeah, so I'll show you an example, and you can do this with MIDI or with like saxophone. I think I have a saxophone project here that could show this pretty well. Okay, so if I wanted to come here, let's say we have saxophone, which is always like the world's worst thing to do generally in MIDI. So if when we're in Very Audio, if we double click here, we could choose to, when we go to we could choose to extract MIDI. And as we do this, we could choose to just have it be notes and no pitch bend data. We could have notes and static pitch bend data or continuous pitch bend data. Now, one of the things we did with VST 3.5 instruments is we could actually have kind of a much higher resolution of pitch bend data. So we could just say note expression with the VST3 tuning curve. So I actually did 2 files here. One that was without kind of the pitch bend data as MIDI, and this one included it. So let's go ahead and just kind of listen to this particular file. So this is how like most MIDI saxophones would sound. So technically it's the right rhythms, the right pitches, but it doesn't really convey any of the emotion or the passion of the instrument. So this one included the expression data, and we can see kind of the extra expression data here. So if we listen to this. So I'll go ahead and play that one with the audio at the same time so we can hear both of them and see how well they line up. So you can definitely, so once you're in the very audio editor, just come over here. And when you do the extract MIDI, just set it up and you have the different pitch bend options directly there. So yeah, you can come up with some really like amazing MIDI transcriptions that really convey kind of, the subtlety that's, so often lost in MIDI. Okay, we have a question. Hello. Is there no latency while recording, but after I insert plugins like wave compressors affect latency 2 to 3 seconds? How can I solve it? Please help me. So, every plugin that you insert will have latency. So, if you, as we kind of looked at earlier in the mix console here, we could actually look at what the channel latency is of particular plugin. So, as I will just enable the channel latency view that we see here, and as we go to, different instruments as inserts, like convolution reverbs will generally be, will have more latency. So let's say if I have that latency, that's a algorithmic reverb. So let's come here to, let's say reverence. So that will have some latency. Let's add your dynamics. So let's say like a multiband envelope shaper, a multiband. So generally these can be a little more heavy on the latency side. So let's do like a multiband compressor again. So as we look at these, now a lot of times you may have like a live mode, and live mode would allow the plugin to kind of look ahead, and that can minimize latency, which is helpful for tracking. But again, if you come here, we could see exactly how much latency each plugin can cause within the signal path. Now, you mentioned in the question as like 2 or 3 seconds. So generally, Cubase will look at this and determine, what the plugin is and automatically compensate by shifting the track earlier in time to play back so that there's no latency. So when you say like plugins like a wave compressor affect latency 2 to 3 seconds, how can I solve it? That would probably be indicative that maybe, there's an issue. Try it with other compressors and see if you notice the same thing. When Cubase first starts up, you may notice it's scanning through the plugins. And what it's actually doing is it's measuring the latency of each plugin. So it could be that maybe that plugin is not reporting the right latency, but I haven't seen a plugin that's really caused 2 to 3 seconds of issues. So, but try a different plugin out of curiosity, and you may want to check to see if there's any updates for that particular plugin if it's causing 2 or 3 seconds latency once it's inserted. Okay, question. I'm using Cubase 10.5 and I'm trying to import a WAV file created in FL Studio 20, but it's sounding horrible. What am I doing wrong? it could be, make sure, I think, I've gotten questions from people, from FL Studio users, and I think sometimes they have almost like their own, like maybe not a standard WAV file, but a compressed WAV file format that's often used. So decoding that may not be the best thing, but there's a preference, and it could be maybe a sample rate conversion. So if we, go to your preferences, and I think if you go to editing, to audio, and there's a setting here on import audio files that to open the options dialog. And this is one of those like little dialog boxes that pops up once, and you can say, do not show this again. But make sure that the original file, make sure that's an original WAV file. And if you, and check to see, what sample rate you exported it in. So if you did like an 88.2 and you're doing a 96K or 48K, that could affect, the audio quality as it's resampling that particular file. But really kind of check. I think my guess would be that it's going to be like a sample rate mismatch or a sample rate conversion that's causing it. And make sure that it's a full resolution WAV file, because I think there's another format that program uses that often, is kind of like a compressed format. So try to avoid that. And, and I think that would probably solve it for you. And if not, you could send me, you could email me a link to perhaps download the file. I'd be happy to take a look at it if you want to send it to me at clubcubase@steinberg.te. Okay, so we have someone from the happiest town in the UK. It's apparently official, Lee on the Sea. Oh, I like the name. Sounds good. All right, so and let's move on. Some other questions. Thanks again for all the great questions. So question, can you show us some cool macros that would save a lot of time for editing? I'll show you one. I think I had it set up from a previous Hangout. And this is always kind of a question where sometimes if you have like a particular solution you're looking for, that could be helpful. So let me just see if it was in this one. I think I may have a project set up for it. Yeah, got lucky. All right, so let's say if we have a vocal file and it has lots of breaths. So we listen to this.
Thought I would be the very last one to leave. I plan on loving you forever, don't you see?
So if we wanted to kind of minimize those particular breaths as we're kind of working with the file, one of the things that we could do is, I created a macro and I tweaked it over the years a little bit. I call it a minimized breath macro. And in essence, what it does is, and it looks like a monster macro, and it's not that bad once you kind of do it. And I'll kind of leave it up for a little bit, so you could pause the screen if you need to kind of reproduce this. I would gladly kind of pass on all these macros, but the macros are really a part of the key commands. And if I send you my macros, it would involve me sending all your key commands and could just overwrite your key commands. So it's better sometimes just to kind of make your own macros. But the idea is basically I would select an area with the range tool. That range tool would split that region. It would switch to the object selection tool, advance by one frame, select the events under the cursor, and then it would basically just drop the volume by 12 dB, and then kind of set up the different options again to have that go. So let's go ahead and just take a look at it in use here real quick. So I think if we kind of start here, we have some good breaths.
thought I would be.
All right, so let's say just right there, what I want to do is I'm just going to start with my range tool. I'll just select that breath. And I'll just kind of listen to it again, see. So I'll just select that particular breath, and then I'll just do the minimize breath macro. And that just dropped it down by 12 dB. Because sometimes if you turn, a lot of people will just silence it. But then if it doesn't have like a noise floor, it's almost like a light switch going on and off. So
The very last one to leave.
And I'm just going to switch my transport behavior really quickly into preferences from earlier in the Hangout. Okay, so it's just
last one to leave.
So big, huge breath. We want her to sound like she does breathe. So we'll just kind of come over here. And then what's cool about this is you could actually just run it twice if you need to. So I could just say, so as we do this.
Last one to leave. I plan on love.
Because I see people that always want like a magic plugin that, deep breaths everything. And they're always very susceptible to issues. But I think kind of manually doing it, and you could assign a key command for it. And, this way you could just.
I plan on loving you forever.
And I think I just have it on a key command there to run it. And now as we do that.
Loving you forever, don't you see?
So that's, I think, a pretty good macro that could save a lot of times. And just as another reference point, we'll go ahead and just open it up. And I will leave that macro visible there. So, if you haven't experimented with macros, that could make a big difference for you. Okay. Okay, so it says when I record audio from the first bar, it prints the wave with a delay. I haven't come across that. But, when you run into stuff like that, try to disable or toggle your constrained delay compensation. But I'm not sure if it's late or if there's like a delay effect. So, that would be, but if it sounds like it's maybe delayed, try to just toggle your constrained delay compensation there. Okay, so question, Greg, could you do a head-to-head where you tried Nuendo for a week to find out whether upgrading for the extra features of Nuendo has too many cumbersome features for a Cubase user to operate smoothly? I work intimately, with Nuendo as well as Cubase. And it's really, it's not necessarily, the functionality will be identical. And if there's a feature in Nuendo that, like if you're doing, the ADR stuff is in there, the game audio stuff is in there for, connecting with Wise by Audio Kinetic. For that handshake, the Dolby Atmos stuff is in there. But if you're not using those features, it's not going to hinder you or, it's not going to be cumbersome because you just won't go to that part of the program. So I think it's going to be the same, and if, the question I get a lot is, should I upgrade to Nuendo? And I would say, if you're doing, if you want to do Dolby Atmos, Nuendo is a great choice for that. And some people are like, why would I ever do Dolby Atmos? And some people are like, yes, that's the delivery format I need to be working in. If you need to do, all the different things for, making music for media. So I would, if I had to have one sentence, I would say, if you're doing the music for a film, Cubase is way more than sufficient for that. If you're doing all the mixing the music, doing the dialogue, doing Foley editing, doing sound design, incorporating that to a film and a game and a music release, then, Nuendo can make more sense. If you're doing, conforming, if that's a big thing for you, if you need to rename, 16,000 audio files in a project based on an Excel spreadsheet and extract the names for that, that's more of a Nuendo thing. But, for composing, you could work the same way in both programs. So, and those extra features aren't going to be cumbersome. You only really get involved with them when you're doing that particular function. So, if you still have doubts, try just to get a Nuendo trial version and see if those features are needed in your workflow. And if they are, it's a fantastic investment. So, but it's really, it's not necessarily a head-to-head thing, because they're really, you can think of Nuendo as being all the Cubase 10 feature set, but augmented with additional functionality. So, okay, so we have a question. Hello, I'm from India. There's no latency when recording, but after insert plugins like Wave Comp affect latency. Okay, so we covered that already. Okay, so you see Sir Robert checking in. It's good. All right. So let's go through some more questions. Okay, so I see some more comments about the record audio from the first part, prints to wave with a delay. So yeah, check your, check the constrained delay compensation. All right, good to see Roger Hooper in the Hangout. I've known Roger almost my entire career at Steinberg. He was incredibly helpful for me when I started going to Washington Music Center as a young, fresh out of college rep. Okay. Question. What's the one killer feature that you've seen in any other DAW that you'd like on Cubase? I don't really check out the other DAWs, so I'm probably not the right person to ask. So I don't study the other programs. I'm really kind of just focused on what Steinberg is doing. And, there's so much in Cubase, but I don't really... I'm probably not the person to ask. I mean, I have my wish list of features like everyone else, and I've shared those with people before on the Hangouts, but I don't really study the other programs. I just kind of can do everything in Cubase or Nuendo for my needs. So, all right, let's go through some more questions. Thanks everyone for great questions. Hope everyone's learned a tip or trick. So it says, hi, Greg. Hope all is well. Just getting Cubase 10.5 set up after installing yesterday. Sorted MMC control of ADAT and generic remote control for MIDI transport control on the console surface. Great. Yeah. We still have people that are doing lots of transfers from ADATs and stuff like that. There's good money in doing transfers from D88s and ADATs and analog tape. So, but it's great that, Cubase still has all those functions and still works with all that kind of gear from that era as well. And that was one of the things that really attracted me to Cubase when I started, was it actually could control like a tape machine. I think it was a Fostex R8, like in a 1/2-inch 8-track tape machine, and you could control all the transport from Cubase, which is great. Okay. Okay, moving on. Okay, so it's probably in addition. My timeline just jumped way ahead. Sorry, let me just. Sorry, my timeline. Okay, so I may have lost a couple questions. I'm sorry. But sometimes in the Hangouts, our timeline will just jump maybe when it gets too many. So, okay, so sorry if I lost a couple questions. So we have a question, Greg, another question. For some reason, I can't trigger the chord pads anymore with my MIDI keyboard, Cubase 10.5. What am I doing wrong? I know, well, I'm not sure if it was in 10 or Cubase 10.5, but make sure, I think if you go to Studio Setup, here you could see the chord pads, and, you know, make sure that you have this input going on here. But I think you should be, I'll just load up a quick instrument sound here just to make sure. Right, and try to just go to the chord pads. It's kind of a cool patch. Anyway, so make sure that, you know, in your studio menu, the studio setup, this is one of the things that did change. You get a chord pads entry, and then you have kind of a remote setup. So make sure that you have that configured. And also you could choose chord pads to be just, you know, like a particular input on a track. So if you wanted to just play the chord pads, I would kind of check those two things. And I think that you would probably be okay. All right. We had someone checking in from Kenya. That's great. Is there a question? Is there an easy way to duplicate an insert effect to another track within the arranger view, not switching to the mix console view? Let's give it a shot. Just add a couple audio tracks here. Okay, so let's say I have an insert. Try a couple of things here real quick. I think you could do it if you go to, not there, if you go to the mix console and just go to your sends, that you could hold down the Alt key and click. But I don't think there's a way of kind of copying it. You know, if it's open, you could move it or copy it. Let me just undo that mixer function quickly. So you could drag from one track to another if you hold down the Alt. Just saying if we could. So, but I don't think there's a way to do it like select this, or if I move down. But you could do that without having to go to the console. I know it's not the exact process that you would like, but let me just see. Let's say if I'm here, I have this. You know, I think you could save it as a preset. You could save the effects track preset, but that doesn't really save you that much time. And let me see if I have this open. Yeah, so I don't know a way to do it directly other than the lower zone mix console. So, all right, so had someone tell me I'm boring, so that's always helpful. I'm sorry. Okay. Okay, so at Greg, in Cubase 10.5 Pro, what are the advantages of using expression mapping for articulations against drawing in my own key switches in the key editor? Thank you. So some of the advantages are, especially like when you go, so a lot of people will do key switching several different ways. So a lot of times you may have a note that's kind of out of range that does a key switch that people manually draw in. So if I come, let's say, to my violin part here, and we look at it in the editor, and I draw in just kind of key switches here. So I'll just go back to the beginning. And I do my articulations here. One of the things that gets... So let's say if I wanted to switch these to spiccato, and then to legato, back here to legato, and let's do pits. And then go back. So we could have our key switches here. So if we have just notes, the one thing that's the, killer thing is, those notes aren't actually harmonically or musically relevant as MIDI notes. So when you go to the score editor, those notes don't show up here. So if I had notes that were set up as key switches and I wanted to print the parts out, they would automatically show up, and you could have to kind of manually hide, which is kind of a nuisance. But if you come here, we could actually see that, the articulations from the key switches can actually be written in. And within the score editor, we could see your expression map. And now you could just say, here I just wanted this to be, to go to this particular articulation to spiccato there. And that would do the key switch. So those are some of the advantages of the expression maps versus just drawing in a MIDI note for key switches to switch articulations and sample instruments. Okay, so we have a question. Maybe this was already covered, but do you have any preferences for time stretching algorithms? I kind of usually leave it to the default. I think the Elastique is more sophisticated. So, we keep some of the older algorithms for, compatibility's sake. So when you come here, so a lot of times, if you're doing Vari audio, that's going to be based on the standard algorithm, but you could also, my rule of thumb is, if you're doing 600 tracks of audio, maybe that's when you go to the efficient mode. If you're doing a lot of very complex harmonic stuff, a lot of times, I find that the default, like the Elastic time, I think is the default, tends to work very well. And you could use the tape if you wanted to mimic an analog tape machine, slowing down or speeding up as well. So, a lot of times I kind of keep the defaults personally. And if I need to do like a tape stop effect, I may just, throw the tape algorithm on. So, okay. Okay, so we have a question. Any tips for changing the entire track tempo on all audio tracks, multiple in a project? Yeah, it's pretty easy to do. So once you kind of understand what kind of the musical mode is doing, so let's just jump back to like, let's just do like a whole band kind of thing. Okay, so let's say I just come here, and I didn't like the tempo of this project.
I know you're looking good. I'm in the neighborhood. I got some cheap wine. Let's have a good time. I never promised you.
So what I could do is, you know, if I think this will probably be like 165 BPM.
But if you're missing me, let it be.
But if I wanted to just, you know, change the tempo, we could, you know, two ways to approach it. One is to go into your pool window, and we could just go directly over here. We can see all of our audio files. So we can see that the tempo is kind of set here for all of the files. And if it was, you know, whatever the project was recorded at, all those will be selected. So I'm going to just, you know, select all the files in my pool window. And I can do that, select the top, hold down the shift key, select the bottom, and I'm going to enable musical mode for all of them. So now I could just,
Hit the road. Gonna rock. Gonna roll.
so say I wanted to be 144.
Gonna rock. Gonna roll. And a go.
120
We got one night. We're gonna get it right.
or 188
We're gonna crank it up and maybe start a fight. Now time
or
is running
200.
out, but I'll be back again until
Or if you just wanted to draw in, let's say, you know, I'll go to my tempo track. I can just add my tempo track here. I think it's probably going to show up. Let me see if I have a tempo track already. Okay, so here's my tempo track. And now once I activate it, I can say, okay, we start at, I think our original tempo is 185.
the next time. It's not
Then I could just come here and say, okay, let's jump. And I wanted to, at this point, slow down. And then I wanted to ramp slower and then speed up here. So now we just kind of have ridiculous tempo changes.
until the next time. It's not the end. Hit the road. Gonna rock. Gonna roll. I got no
So then it'll just
control.
gradually
Hit the
slow down.
road. Gonna rock. Gonna roll. And go. Hit the road. Gonna rock.
Then it's going to speed up.
Gonna roll. We got no control. Hit the road. Gonna rock. Gonna roll. And we go. My snakeskin bag, my leather rags.
So once everything is in musical mode and, you know, it's, yeah, you have a tempo, you could just, all the tracks will kind of be tempo parasites for you without having to do a lot of work. Okay. Question. Hi. If there is time to discuss, is there any video player app for iPad that receives SMPTE or MIDI timecode for syncing video playback on that iPad to offload computer processing? I don't know of any. I haven't searched for any. I know some people, you know, will just use like separate computers for that. But I don't know of one that would. I don't know of one, but maybe someone else has an idea. So, but I could maybe do a little bit of research in it. But I'm not sure if a lot of iOS stuff really kind of syncs to SMPTE or MIDI timecode. But I could be wrong. Okay. So question related to groups. Are there any plans to either develop group freeze or group render in place functions? I know printing is the current best method. I've heard some, I've seen it on the survey of like doing a group freeze, but when you do export an audio mix down, what you can do here is just kind of take, all your group channels. If you have multiple group channels, you could render those and have those imported. But I did see it on the survey. One of the things that was also done with the, recently with the import tracks from Project. So, there was probably someone working on this. So when you go to import tracks from Project, you can now import, groups and folders as well. So it's kind of the opposite side. But I did notice that it was one of the survey questions, and those survey questions have a lot of input on and their reaction to what gets actual, implemented for new features as kind of empirical data from users. So they often do these big user surveys, and then the users aren't happy with the surveys that they contributed data for in the end. So it's always interesting. Okay. Okay, going through different questions. Thanks for all the questions. Okay, just reading through comments. Okay, so I see a comment. Can you guys please suggest to Steinberg to implement 2 really easy features, or implement 2 really easy and should have been there all along things? 1, the group tracks in the mixer should mirror the layout of the project editor. And 2, why can't we have the parameters that are automated have like a red dot or circle around them so that we know what is automated and what is not? Something that a lot of people miss on point number 2. So if you've done automation, so let's say if I go to this track and I do automation, I'll automate it this time. So one of the parameters in the automation parameters you could set that a lot of people miss is if you go to the automation panel and hit F6, if you go to the settings, is this reveal parameters on right. So anything that is has been written will automatically show up in the automation lanes to indicate what so what has been automated, but it doesn't show it on a parameter. But it could be hard to show exactly, to have something outlined for every single parameter to indicate automation. So, and I'm trying and I see the group tracks in the mixer should mirror the layout of the project editor. So I'm not sure exactly what that means. Maybe if you could give a little more information or email me at clubcubase@steinberg.de, that'd be helpful. Okay. Okay, so it says, I'm still a beginner of Cubase. I have a problem about the first time recording. Okay, so if you're doing a project for the very first time, let's do just a new project here. One of the things that I like to have set up is to have a folder for every single project. So when we do a new project, you'll get greeted with a Steinberg hub. So for your very first time, there's different presets here for different types of scenarios. For my uses, I'll just say empty. And you may have this go to a default location. I generally will have it prompt for a project location here. And this is the folder where every file will be stored. So we'll say create empty just for now. And then what I want to do is you could right click or click on the plus sign here and just add an audio track. Here we could choose what input we want that source to be recorded from. Do we want it to be a mono or stereo track? So if I want to record my voice or one microphone on a guitar, I could do mono. If I wanted to record, two microphones at once for like a choral concert, I could record stereo. And then I could just choose to add track. I want to tell Cubase to record on this particular track. And if you probably by default, if you want to hear the input of the recording, is to make sure that this monitor is enabled. So you could record without hearing it, or you could hear it without recording. And as we mentioned before earlier in the Hangout, if you go to your Cubase preferences to VST, you could just set this up to under auto monitoring, set it up for tape machine style. And then as soon as you kind of hit record, you're all set. And the one thing I should also mention is just to name your track. So you say this is, vocal Bob or whatever. So that way, when you record, the name of this track will get embedded and placed onto the audio file itself. And that's really kind of all you have to do for recordings. And you could just kind of keep repeating that same process to record more tracks at once. So hopefully that'll help you out with doing your first recording. Okay. And I see a third suggestion would be macro support. So I'm not sure what additional macro support you would need. Okay. Okay, so let's go ahead and okay, so you see a question, how to add a reference track to AB, or is buying the AB plugin better? I think it's unnecessary, so you could do it quite easily inside of Cubase. And one of the things that you want to do is to make sure that the reference point isn't going through like your effects on the master bus. So we'll show you how you do kind of a reference with Cubase very easily. And this is kind of using the control room, and there's some other ways, and my computer didn't like that. Sorry about that. All right, I'm just going to pause the Hangout for a second. Let me see if I could just bear with me for a second, and I'll see if we get this. Sometimes I have a lot of different things going on at once for the Hangouts. Okay, I'm just going to pause the Hangout. Give me just a second. I'm going to reboot really quickly. And let me see if I get this recorded. Just hang on. All right, so I think I'm back. Sorry about that. It's always a difficult balance of having multiple, 3 audio interfaces that have to go on simultaneously. So I think we're back now. Just going to make sure audio is coming through. All right, so let me just bear with me just a second. And okay, so we had a question about the reference tracks, how to set that up, or do you need to buy like an A/B plugin? So this project, I actually have kind of like a reference track on this particular project. So I'm just going to EQ this a bit goofily. And so let's say if I solo this track. So say I just load a track into my reference track. And what you want to do is to basically make sure that if you have effects on your master bus and processing, that your master reference track does not go through that, because it's kind of like taking a mastered file and mastering it again. So what we want to do is to basically just set up a control room and create a Q mix. So I'm going to go to my audio connections, go to my control room, and we'll call this, I'll add a Q mix, and we'll just call this a reference. So as we just hit OK there, and I'm not even going to assign it to anywhere. And what I want to do is to take this track here where I have my reference track loaded onto, and I'm not going to send it out to my main bus. So what I want to do is to send it to no bus. And then I want to go to my Q sends. And this is my reference Q send here, number 2. So we'll just make sure. So we'll just again come to our audio connections. And we see our reference 2 is going to there. So, and now at this point, what I could do is I could play back this project. And now when I go to my secondary Q mix, so we'll just say Q2. And I'll unmute this track. So here, this is the reference track, and that we hear here. And this isn't going through the master effects processing. And now I can take my mix. And now if I wanted to go to my master fader here, and say I'll do kind of, so I could listen to my reference track here, and then versus my mix. So just make sure that we have this set to 0 dB. And then you could just go back and forth between different reference tracks pretty easily with that. Okay. Okay, so I see a comment, maybe no reduction in price for Cubase when every other place is. We just did a 40% off discount. So for upgrades, we're also doing a promotion for VST Connect Pro. We're doing the Stay Home collection, Stay Home Elements collection as well. So you could have 60 days free of either Absolute 4 VST collection, Dorico Elements, Wavelab Elements, or Cubase Elements. So there are a lot of, reduction in prices that have been going on. So, and there's promotions that go on throughout the whole year as well. So, pay attention to all the different promotions going. All right. Let me just go through some more questions. Okay. Okay, just kind of going through. All right. Okay, so a lot of discussions where people are growing up. All right. Okay, so we have a question. Hi, Greg. Question. What is the easiest way to copy whole mix setting, inserts, sends, levels from existing mix? Next one, mixing whole album. All tracks are already recorded in separate projects. An easy way to it, if you have kind of the same combination of, tracks and, you could come over here to the mix console and we'll select all the tracks in your project. So let's say I'll just come here. Select all those tracks. And if we go to this little drop down menu here, you could choose to just see, I may have some other tracks selected, but if we just select your tracks here, you'll see just save selected mixer channels. So you could do that. Another method that was just kind of introduced with 10.5 is you could import tracks from project. So let's say if I wanted to import tracks from a project, let me just find something that would make sense. So at this point, we could select another project and we could select all the tracks and import them. And then we could choose to kind of put them into the same track names if they carry over. So this way you could import all the channel and inspector settings and not automation and not the events. So there's kind of two different ways within the mix console to save it or just to save it and import the files directly there. Okay. All right, so my track gets some high latency after record. Can't fix it. So, make sure that, when people are saying that they're, try to, if you have a lot of plugins turned on, you could try to, if you're finding that it's off, try adjusting the constraint delay compensation button here. And you could also try to just kind of bypass particular plugins and see if they cause a problem. But my first thing would be to toggle the constraint delay compensation. Okay. Okay, so we have a question from Bangladesh. How can I broadcast audio of my Cubase session to streaming software like OBS? What I do is I take a microphone, and I kind of went through this in the last Hangout, but what I do personally is I take my microphone and I combine it with the audio output from my laptop, and I feed it into a mixer that has a USB output. And what I do is, and I'll show you on my OBS settings here, is I just set up my computer display, and then the audio from my Cubase and my voice are going into and it's just an audio input device, and I just set that up, and that's what I use to kind of stream out. So that's why I found it's kind of worked the best without having to do like really odd software routing of audio. So some people use a voice meter, but you could just give that a try. I find that it works really well. So okay. Okay, so let's go ahead. Can you quantize event start positions on parts in the arrange view? It's not necessarily quantizing that you could do, but you can snap based on that. So, if you come, let's say if I have my snap turned on, that's the letter J. You hit the letter J and you can see this icon. I could have the grid and I could have it set to bar. So now as I move an event, it's only going to go and snap to the bar. So it's not necessarily a quantization, but I can snap. And if I need to snap to a smaller interval, I could say, let's snap to a beat. So now as I move, it's just going to snap on the beats. Or you could have it set, if you need it to be a smaller value, you could have it set to use quantize. So now if I wanted to snap to eighth notes. A fourth mode, it's kind of interesting, is to adapt to zoom. So if you're zoomed out here, we could have events snap like to the bar. But if we're zoomed in to a pretty high degree, at this point, we could have it snap to like 64th or 32nd notes. So it's not quantizing the events, but you could have them snap to the grid that way. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, it says, can you show us a easy way to map VSTs to a controller, as the quick control system is really quite counterintuitive, it seems. Well, you can do, so let's say if I wanted to go, let's just find, I think I have some MIDI stuff in here. Okay, so let's say if I have this particular instrument here, a lot of instruments will give you the capability to, once they're open and you have a parameter in the instrument, is just by, you could learn CC. So a lot of the Steinberg instruments, I could just learn CC and move a fader and have that be controlled. But it could really depend on each individual instrument. So, but even if the instrument doesn't have a learn CC, you could just come over here and add this to your 8 quick control slots. So once you have your controller set up, so if you go to your studio setup and you go to your VST quick controls, here, you could learn the controllers that you have for your particular device, move that, and that's going to control, and capture that. And you could assign these to quick controls, but a lot of different instruments, you could just right click and learn CC. I think just about all the Steinberg instruments allow you to do that. I can't necessarily speak for third-party plugins, but it's a fairly common technique. So even if I added a retrolog track in here, I could just learn CC, move a parameter, and then that is just automatically controlling it right there. So those are some easy ways to work with it. But, once you kind of get your 8 quick control set up, you could just right click on a parameter and add it to a quick control slot as well. Okay. Let's move on. Okay, so a question from Orrin Bynum also comes to our Club Cubase and DC meetings. Is there a vocal template or some vocal presets I can use to help start making my vocals sound professional every single time? If you come over here, you could probably, I'm sure, I usually kind of do it on a case-by-case basis, but there's probably different track presets. So if you right-click on a particular track, you could just say, I want to go to vocal, and there's all these different vocal track presets. So I would, start playing around with some of these and just say, I wanted, a male voice for this or female. And at that point, you could just, let's say if I add an audio track, and at this point, you could just right click and load track preset and play around with these. And these are, done by a lot of top engineers. So when you open up the particular track, this will have, EQs and the channel strip all kind of used internally. So that's a great starting place. And then you could tweak as you see fit. But there's lots of great options available just by right clicking and going to track presets. And you could take, if you find that you did something once, you could just simply, at that point, save it as a track preset as well that you could open up. Okay. Okay, moving on. Okay, so I see a question. After doing a complete drum in MIDI via Groove Agent, normally I separate all the parts and next export them as mono channels, always in mono. In drum context, mono is fine or should be stereo. Generally, mono is fine. I know some people like to keep stereo, maybe overheads and stereo room mics, depending on how the collection was recorded. But, mono definitely works for a lot of people. And then you could, do all your processing. So either way would be fine. Okay, so just coming over here, just reading through some more questions. Okay, so question, can someone please explain how I can use my regular keyboard, Yamaha YPG 535, when using sounds in my contact player? So once you have an instrument loaded up, so again, if I come here and if I wanted to play pad shop sounds or a contact or any other instrument, you could just drag and drop. We're going to load up the sound. Make sure that you have your MIDI, your Yamaha keyboard. So you could have that connected via MIDI. I'm not sure if that particular model has USB. So if it has USB, you'll see it probably show up as a port here, and you can choose all MIDI inputs. And then all you have to do is arm for record and then just start playing. And then you'll be able to play back any of your software instruments using your Yamaha keyboard or any other controller. Okay. And just seeing comment, there's no MIDI out, so you probably have to, connect it via USB. If it has USB, then you should be okay. Okay, so it says, can you explain the loop back function in my UR28M? What does it do? When do I need it, on or off? The intention of the loop back feature is like helpful in like gaming when you have the audio for the game going out of the UR28M and you want it to have your microphone audio blended with that. So what you could do is just simply take the audio outs from the game, route it out to the UR28M, and then you could just yell at people with a microphone that's connected. That's kind of the intention of loopback. So a lot of times for musical stuff, people will use it for different streaming purposes as well. So you could blend your microphone in with content going out of your computer. But that's kind of really the intention of loopback. So for like a multi-track, music production scenario doesn't really have so much, people don't use it for that. It's more for kind of multimedia and streaming applications. Okay, so we'll move on to some other questions. And we had some people have mailed some questions in, so let's go ahead and get to some of those. So question was, how can I add a Roland U20 in the MIDI device manager? It's not in the list. What kind of file should I look for from the internet? Is there a way to do a MIDI sysx export from the U20 so I can import settings and patch names in Cubase? I'm new into that. It'd be appreciated to have a step-by-step hangout or maybe a separate video. So the U20 is actually the keyboard version of the U220 module. So if we come over here, we could go to your studio setup, or let's go to your studio, and you'll see under more options, you'll see something called a MIDI device manager. So what we want to do is we're going to click on install device. We'll see this list. And in here, I believe there's a U220. Yeah, so we'll say U220 Roland. We'll hit OK. We want to define where this is connected to in your MIDI interface. And now I'll just say, okay, I have it connected to my UR24C. And I will go ahead and let's add a MIDI track. So we'll have to add a MIDI track to do this. We'll add the track. And then for its output, I just want it to choose, and we'll just come right over here and we'll say our U220, and those patches will be the same. We click here and then we could see, sorry about that. We'll just click here where it says off. And then you'll be able to see all the patch names and select the patch name. So the U20 is just the keyboard version of the Roland U220, and the patches and the architecture is exactly the same. So let's come over here. I'll just go back to our feed and go back to another question. Okay, let's see, people trying to... Okay, so we see question, how to fix latency when using a plugin on the track. One thing that kind of throws people off a lot is when they're, tracking. Sometimes people will come here and put like a reverb on. I go to record an audio track. And they're like, okay, I want reverb on the track. So they'll come over here, add a send for reverb. So we'll say, okay, we'll do this, and we'll add, compressors and EQs. And every time that you add your different processes here, these can take time. So, when you can, try to avoid adding the effects during the recording. Some interfaces are smart enough. Like if we have the Steinberg UR series, I'll just create an empty project here quickly. And if I'll just set up my outputs here, my audio connections quickly. So if I have I have a UR24C, so I'm going to just set my outputs here. And the thing that makes that kind of unique is that when we add an audio track, it actually has built-in DSP. So when I come here, we could just say, I wanted to access my the DSP of, and I'll just make sure I have my connections right. So if I have my output set there, I can now come over here and I could access all of my built-in DSP of the unit. So I could do this without any additional latency. So you just kind of get the settings right here. So I could say, you know, I wanted to have a morphing channel strip and I wanted to have my send effect. So I could have built-in reverb, and this is all powered by the computer, by the hardware, the audio interface itself, without any discernible latency. I think it's down to like 100 microseconds, so it's a tenth of a millisecond or something like that. So at this point, you could actually, you know, print that. But if you're just recording and you start adding effects, that could add latency on your signal path. And that's just kind of physics of how it's going to work. So you have to, you know, try to print without effects or get an audio interface that allows you to work in a latency-free mode with its built-in DSP-powered effects. Okay. Let's jump back to another question that was sent in. Okay, so it says, thank you for hosting these great Cubase live streams. I have the following question. Is it possible to extract MIDI from a stereo drum track from all the different drum instruments? It's not really, there isn't a way built into Cubase, and I haven't really seen many programs that have been so successful with it that attempt it. But you know, we could do like drum replacement quite easily in a multi-track, but if you have kick, snare, percussion, and hi-hats and, you know, toms all going on simultaneously, I haven't seen anything that can do a complex stereo mix and kind of decouple it. So I haven't seen anything like that, and there isn't something in Cubase, but if you have a multi-track drum part, you could, you know, from the hit points, you know, come over here for an audio part and just simply, you know, do, you know, you could have it trigger and generate MIDI notes, but nothing that would kind of deconstruct a like a stereo drum loop of multiple drum sources that's included. Okay. Okay, so, and this is probably getting back to the discussion on the Yamaha keyboard. So it says if I connect it into an audio interface using a regular 1/4 inch into the instrument jack, it works great as my keyboard, but I want to use samples on contact. So you really just need to, you know, load up that virtual instrument and make sure that you have, and you may, depending on your, you know, if you have it connected via USB, which I see from the discussion, you probably want to make sure that you see the Yamaha USB driver there. You may have to install that as a separate driver. There's a you know, a Yamaha USB MIDI driver that you may have to. But if you're sending MIDI out, that's kind of a completely separate data stream. So, okay, so let's move on. Okay. Okay, so in question is probably dealing with before, you know, when I put more latencies on a track, I get a latency problem. So, you know, that's, you know, as we discussed, the more instruments you add on your input channel, that's going to increase your latency. So, okay. Okay, so I see a feature request. Can the Very Audio volume waveform show the volume changes? So if you haven't familiar with this is one of the new things that was implemented with version in Cubase 10. So I'll just go ahead and show it real quick, just in case people haven't seen it. So, you know, once we're doing Very Audio editing, all right, so say, here's my parts. You know, one of the things that we could do is Let me adjust my connections very quickly. So if we go to the extended control here, so we'll have kind of default controls, but you could adjust kind of the volume control here. So it's not visually indicated, but I'll pass that on as maybe some way of showing. You can kind of see it, I think. I guess not. So you can see kind of the indication there. But this way you could just increase or decrease the volume. But I'll mention that. That makes sense. Okay. Okay, so seeing more questions about the UR12. So, and playing the contact with the keyboard. So yeah, you don't want to use the audio. It's not going to help get the MIDI into it. So, okay, so we have a lot of discussion, people helping in the comments field. Okay, so we have a question, Greg. How do you show audio wave in the automation lane? So let's take a look at how to do that. So a lot of times when we go to the automation lanes here, you may notice that I think by default that it shows up blank. So if we have automation on a particular track, we could see it show up there, but we don't see the waveform. So if we go to F6, we could go to the settings, and then once you do that, you can say show data on tracks. Then the automation, the waveform, you'll have kind of a reference for your automation there. So now you could kind of write in different automation points as you see fit. Okay, so let's jump back to one of the questions that was sent in. So it says, I can only hear, and this is a bit of a strange one to me. I can only hear VST instruments when I have the direct monitoring orange speaker button clicked on when I play. Once recorded, the MIDI will play back the sound with or without the direct monitoring turned on. So I get sound, but only when I click the button. I've seen dozens of YouTube videos of users using VST and then playing live without the direct monitoring turned on. I use Apollo 8 console, which does not need Cubase's direct monitoring. In fact, the suggested setup is to have direct monitoring set to manual and preferences so that it is never on, except for with my VST instruments, it has to be on. Why is this? So the direct monitor, if this is, I think you're referring to the preference, when we go to the preferences here, that we will see under VST, that we see this auto monitoring style. So this really isn't applicable for virtual instruments. And that direct monitoring is really kind of independent of how it's working in your Apollo console, I would think. I don't have the Apollo hardware. But, if I select a particular MIDI track, I can, let's say I just play, I could, have that particular track there. So I'm passing MIDI to this selected track and not to the bass. When I play the bass, I hear that faintly, but let's say I come here. So if I just have this set to monitor, so that preference is only for audio tracks. It doesn't really matter or have a difference on virtual instrument tracks. So I could sound the instrument, but if I hit record on that track, it's not going to record any data until I actually hit the record button. And now that I do this, it's going to record the data. So as soon as we, so this will pass the signal to the instrument, and this will pass it to the record. And if it's going into the record, you may want to, be able to just, have those two functions independently. One thing to check in this scenario, and it sounds really strange, and I haven't seen that behavior that, and it shouldn't have anything to do with your Apollo control panel or that preference. But one preference that may be affecting it, just out of curiosity, is if you go to editing, or if you go to MIDI, make sure that your MIDI through is active. I would think it would be, but check that just to make sure. But just because you have the Apollo doesn't, and it has its own it has its own direct monitoring, but you still have to have the tracking Cubase if you want it to monitor, set to monitor regardless. You could do direct monitoring through that. But if you have direct monitoring turned on and you don't have the audio activated in Cubase, you're still not going to hear it regardless of what's going on in the Apollo console. I'm about 99% sure on that. So, but I would check that. And again, that preference for the auto monitoring doesn't apply to a virtual instrument track. And a second question that was sent in with this says, also, my MIDI controllers play all instruments at once, even though set to different MIDI channels. I could select Hallian in a project window on MIDI channel 1, but the keyboard will play pad shop even if it's on MIDI channel 2. But only if the direct monitoring is turned on. So if I want to try a chord progression with only the Hallian instrument, I have to turn off the monitoring on pad shop or solo it. It's just becoming a pain going back and forth every single time, especially since I have seen countless people on YouTube and have not have this problem. This seems like it's a simple solution, and it could be like when you're doing channels, one thing to be aware of is like when you're playing in, and it could really depend on what controllers, and that could be very critical, what controllers you're actually using and the MIDI controller. But when you record into Cubase, it's going to actually transmit onto all MIDI channels. Okay. So it gets sent, and so if I have, this particular interface, if this was all going onto the same instrument, but different MIDI channels, Cubase doesn't filter. But if you go to the input transformer, if you need it to filter out other channel messages, you could just come over here to the input transformer, and there's going to be a channel filtering. So you could there's presets. So you could say past channel 1, and that way MIDI channels 2, 3, 4, 5 through 16 for that port won't actually be recorded, and that will filter it out. So check those two things. And also, if you could email me a project or let me know what controller you're using, because I think that could be a culprit in this scenario as well. But it's not going to be necessarily related to the Apollo console. Okay, so question from the Hangout. When I saved a project and reopened it later, all my changes were lost. But I haven't... I haven't come across that ever. It's always kind of saved changes. So I'm not sure what to say, but if you could, So, but I've never run into that. So, but if you have a project it continues to do that on, let me know. But one thing that you could also have set in the back, if you go to preferences under general, here you could just have an auto save. So, and that's usually on by default. So just see if, and that will be saved as a .bak file. So at the same level as your Cubase project. So check to see if you have maybe like a .bak file that was saved, unless you particularly intentionally deactivated the autosave. Okay. Okay. Let's go on. Okay, so just saying question, how can I stretch out my audio in my own tempo? So I think we showed that earlier, but if not, just let me know if you need to see that again. Okay, so we have a question. I used VST, but why I can't record? No have wave of graphy and sound not out. So I'm not sure if you're using a VST instrument or a VST plugin from the question. So if you're using a VST instrument, you're not going to see the waveform because it's going to work with MIDI. And if you're using a VST to record, you could record the automation of the VST, but you'd record it as an audio track. So maybe if you could indicate if it's used a VST, if it's an audio or an instrument plugin, that would be useful. Okay. Okay, so it says, hi, Greg, can you demonstrate beat detective style multi-track drum quantize? I always use Pro Tools for this. Let's go take a look. I think I have a good file to work with. So when we want to do like quantizing of multi-track drums, it can be a little tricky because a lot of times with drums, you're going to have a lot of bleed through on different tracks. So let's go ahead and take like a drum performance here. And I'll just solo this, and let's put the click track on so we can see how tight the drummer was with the click. And you often hear like drum fills be off. So there's a little bit of a rush there on the fill. So even those snare fills there were rushed. And then it kind of got back on. So when we want to do like a multi-track drum quantizing, we could select the top file of our drums. We want to first, select all the files and move them. We could right click and put them into a folder. I have these in a folder already. So this is my drum folder. So we're going to put them into a folder rather. And then I'm going to just double click and we're going to find kind of the rhythmically significant points of the audio file. And I'll just go to my hit points tab. And what I want to do is just to make sure, I'll just go to my kick, and basically you want to make sure that we have, our hit points set. So in this we have like kick, snare, hi-hat are very prominent. So I'm going to do the same for my hi-hat. So I'll just come here. Let's adjust our threshold. So here we can see the bleed through of the kick. So if we listen to it, so we don't want the kick to be included. And let's go to the snare and kind of do the same thing. So we'll set our threshold. So we don't want the snare picking up the hi-hats or the kicks. So once we've done this, and we have a folder track, we could just say group editing. And now as I move one event, they'll all move simultaneously, kind of linked as a group. So we determine kind of our kick hit points, our snare hit points, and the hi-hat. And as we do this, one of the tricky things is if we move just a snare, we have that snare bleeding in the overheads and in the tom mics. We can move the snare, but if it's conflicting with the snare that's in the other sources, that can cause all sorts of phase issues. So when we come here, this is why we do the group editing. I'll go to my quantize setup, and that's going to be right up here in our in this area right here. So I'll just click on the E key. And what we want to do is to choose our priorities. So I'm going to say my kick has a high priority. My snare top will have kind of my secondary priority. And let's adjust my hi-hat to be maybe a third priority. So 5 stars for my kick, 4 for my snare, 3 for my hi-hat. So that kind of has set my priorities, and I want to set, so what I want to do now is, since these are all selected and grouped together, we're going to slice. And as we do this, we're going to see like a zillion audio slices that have been created. And these slices have been based on these criteria and these conditions. So that when we have a snare hitting, we'll have that snare hitting the same time in the overhead tracks and other tracks. So, and I want to set my quantize value. I'm just going to set it to 16th notes here. At this point, I will click on quantize, and it is slightly shifted all of those little slices around. And in some areas, you may notice little gaps that it will leave. So to fix that, what we want to do is just to click on crossfade, and that will, at that point, close up those gaps for us. And now as we play back our drums and we listen to it, and with the click on, we'll hear like those drum fills. So that'd be much more tighter. So that's an easy way of kind of doing a multi-track drum quantize. And so, and it works really well. You know, I've had friends that had to clean up, you know, a bunch of old rock stars drummers who, you know, maybe had some substance issues. And their playing ability isn't quite as, you know, robust as it was in the 80s. So, and it's, you know, and that function has really saved them on a lot of projects. Okay. All right, let's jump back to a question that was mailed in earlier. Okay, so we had a question that was mailed in. It says, for the next Hangout, I'd love to know how to set up the Studio Pass. The Studio Pass is a way using the VST Connect that you could send like, you know, send like the audio out to like a producer in a different location, and you have to actually be on a separate network, and I don't have a separate network set up. So I don't really have the ability to show that, but that's really kind of the intention of it. All right, so let's move on to our question that was mailed in. Okay, so we had a question, you know, how to render to audio in Cubase, in Cubase 7. Thanks for pointing out it didn't, that render in place didn't start until version 8. In Cubase 7, is it possible to route to an audio track and record like you do in a video? So let's say if I'll just do a new project. And I will just have a VST instrument. Okay, so I think this came in maybe version 6, but let's say if I have, all right, so I'll unmute this. So let's say if I just, okay, so what I want to do is to actually, I'm going to create a group channel. And this is kind of realize it's a bit of a left-handed approach. So I will take this particular output channel that we have for our groove agent, and I will just right click here and let's add a group channel to the selected track. And I'm going to make this a stereo group. Okay, I want to add a stereo audio track. Okay, so we're going to call this our drum bus. And let's call this just our drum record. So what I want to do now is to take this track, and I believe this worked in 7. So I'll just kill all that. So on the input for this particular track, instead of like an input from my audio interface, I just want it from groups. So now I could play MIDI here. It's going to be routed to the bus, and this bus output is routed to the drum, to this particular audio track. So now as I hit record, it's now recorded the MIDI and the audio simultaneously. You don't have to do that in real time. You could just, have other buses set up to record and transfer your audio simultaneously. But that's a great way to record both MIDI and audio at the same time. Okay, let's jump back to our live stream. Thanks everyone for great questions. If you've learned something new, just feel free to give a thumbs up. All right. Okay, still seeing a lot of discussion with the Yamaha controller. So make sure that you have the Yamaha USB driver connected to your to your Yamaha on your Mac. All right. Okay, so question, once I recorded audio MIDI track, how can I get notation of it? So once you have MIDI data, so we can come over here and just say, I'll jump back to one of our other projects. We have a dedicated score editor that prints out as well. So I will just get this loaded up. See if my computer is going to cooperate. Let me see if I can exit out real quickly. Sorry about this. It's always a very delicate juggle to make the live streams work here. All right, I'm going to just reboot my machine really quickly. Sorry about that. And so if you just bear with me for a second. All right, so I think we're back. Sorry about that. All right, so let me just get this project open. Okay, so how can we see notation of our project? So all we have to do is just come right over here, and then we could just hit Control or Command R, and you could see the notation. So, it does it, very well for MIDI stuff, with audio. If we have a monophonic source, you may have to do some cleaning up, but with very audio, what we could do is just kind of come over here. And once we have our very audio set, at this point, we could just convert this to MIDI, just as we were showing before earlier in the Hangout. So we'll say extract MIDI. We'll do notes and we'll have the dynamics. And once we come here, this will create a new MIDI track. And we could look at that in notation. We could clean up some of the notation stuff here as well quickly. So let's just do a quick display quantize. So, so you could do some cleaning up in MIDI, but that's how you could get notation out of your different files. All right. Let's go back to a question that was mailed in. Okay. I use Cubase and want to retune everything from A equals 440 hertz to A equals 444. Is there a simple way to do that with all instruments and whatever else is incorporated into Cubase? So the different instruments can be set. So if I wanted to do this particular project, I may have to take the instruments, and this isn't for MIDI stuff. It could be very much dependent on what the actual instrument is going to do. So here, like in a grand, I could set this to A equals 444. And not every MIDI instrument is going to allow you to do this. And I could just take this particular file and we could go to fine tuning on the info line. And I could just raise this up 4. So now, like just with the piano and the vocal in this example, we will hear that these will just be knocked up. Let me just check my connections here. Sorry about that. So as soon as I come here, and if I wanted to go to my other instruments, so I have a Halion Sonic SE here, and I think you could, in options, you could set the tuning scale as well. So it really can depend on each particular instrument. So the audio is really easy to do. Just select it and add 4 in the timeline, and then you can do an actual test and see if it makes a big difference for you. But that's how you could do it. So, but for the MIDI information, it's going to depend upon the instrument, because the MIDI spec, I believe, is an A equals 440. But many instruments will allow you to change that. Okay, so it says, question mailed in. I really appreciate the effort and expertise you've been blessing us with in these Hangouts. It's a really nice way to get tips and techniques while we're doing the home thing. I always learn something. Thanks for the kind words. Here's a question. Here's a couple questions. A three-parter. Is there a good way to search for presets or patches that have key switches? A lot of the Steinberg content, when we do this, like when we say, if I go to Halion Sonic SE and we look at this, a lot of them that have key switches, when we go to load, you could just kind of search, and let's say we want to do all, and a lot of them have like a VX extension. So if you just kind of come over here and hit VX, these are generally ones that have a lot of multi-sample and different articulations. Different, if it's an orchestral library, probably every patch may have, there may be like a combi patch that has a lot of them. But for a lot of the kind of mainstream instruments, like within Halion Sonic, that's a good way to determine if that has a, like multi-articulations. So question, are any expression maps provided with Cubase? And again, for Cubase instruments, we could do, once we go to, and we look at our particular instruments here. So I want to go to this. We'll see our, expression maps, like within the editors. So say if I just double click here, you'll see your expression maps when we go into the editor. And, once you kind of have those loaded, you could just import the key switches automatically for like the basses. And that's kind of unique to, I don't know that other companies don't do that. But I know that's kind of based on the Halion engine. So when it does that, it will be able to extract that information automatically. So as you build a multi-articulation instrument within Halion, that information is automatically extracted. I don't think other sample playback instruments offer that capability. And it says, any way to import expression maps from other VSTs like Sample Tank. I would contact the companies and see if they have them available, but a lot of them are, once users do them, they share them. And that's a great thing. So there's probably different articulation maps that are available, but there may not be a lot in Sample Tank, but you could, definitely get in touch with IK Multimedia and see if they have some of this stuff. Okay, so let's go through. Okay. So question, hi, please, how can I make my sound loud enough, especially at the mastering stage? I often find many commercial songs louder than mine. One of the things that you could do, is, a lot of people will render their file. So, an easy way of doing this is, let's say, I want to take this song, I will render a particular file. So, I will just kind of pop over here. Let's do an export audio mix down, and we'll just do a quick render. And I will incorporate this into and create an audio track. So, let me just set my left and right locators around. So I'll just base it on the locators. So a lot of people, one thing I see that a lot of people do is use their master fader for their volume monitoring device. So when you come to your master fader here in your mix console, make sure that this isn't your volume control and this isn't down. I see a lot of people use this as their monitor volume, and this is really the intention of the control room volume that you could access here. So now when I'm here, we could just have our mix down. We have it imported in the project, and we'll go ahead and just solo it. And I probably had the vocal soloed accidentally. Yeah, so I'll just do that again. Undo that. So, but once you have kind of like your stereo mix down file, you could, go to audio processes and normalize it. and that could get it up. A lot of people will run, like the cheap, I have a mastered solution to quick, dirty ways to put a brick wall limiter on the master bus before you export. So if you just come there, just, run a brick wall limiter and, knock it down to -1 dB or something like that. So, but also you may notice that, you have something and you look at the waveforms and they look like they're the same, but they sound completely different. And that's years and years of experience, and arranging can make a big difference. So all those years of working and, constantly solving solving issues and getting better at your craft, and it takes time. But it's a pretty typical question. But those are some things that you could do to make your final export a bit louder. Okay, so let's move on to some other questions that were mailed in. Thanks for everyone's great questions. So it says, I make a change to Vary Audio. I get the window that gives me the choice of continue, new version, or cancel. What does each do, and what's the best choice? So, and this is kind of a preference in general, and it's one that people often kind of shut off. And if you go to editing audio, and it says on processing shared clips, and we see these same three options. So one is to process the existing clip. So that will change the original audio file to the changes. Generally, as a rule of thumb, I choose new version. So I have the original intact, and it's making whatever changes that I'm making in that particular section. That's creating a new version of the audio file, and it's using that instead of the original. And cancel would not do any of the changes. So at that point, you just want to make sure that, so those are kind of what those mean. So continue allows you to, overwrite new version would do that, and cancel wouldn't change the original file. Okay, so we have a question. After changing a track to musical mode, in the pool, it indicates musical mode on the info line, but I don't get the note and a squiggly line symbol in the right-hand corner of the event. So here, like when I have something go into musical mode, we're talking about this little line here. So I'm going to select this event, and we can see that as soon as musical mode's enabled, that track, that little icon shows up. So sometimes maybe check to make sure that it's not a part that's underneath. I've seen that sometimes, especially on vocal tracks. But if you want to send me a screenshot, that could be helpful too. Okay, question. After comping a vocal track, is it best to render or bounce before adding effects and animation, or do neither? You don't really have to bounce. I know some people will choose to bounce the selection if they're handing it off to someone else and they're just kind of in the middle of the production process, but there's nothing that requires you to bounce. I know a lot of people tend to bounce to clean up things. So, if they're just doing editing and they need to pass it off to someone who's doing mixing, that the person mixing makes it as easy for them as possible without which of the 13 vocal files do I use is the right one. So that's when people would often choose to bounce. So you could actually kind of keep it a bit more, if you wanted to keep it very clean, but if you kind of could keep track of it in your head, it's not necessary to bounce. All right, let's go back to our live feed. Okay. Thanks again for all the great questions. Okay. And I'm seeing why is that better than using a noise gate? Maybe this is going back to the minimize breaths macro. And often I think noise gates can, I think it's very believable when there's a little bit of constant noise floor. And again, gates can be on or off. And sometimes, like in a very intimate vocal, you may want that noise floor to still be present, but just be diminished. All right. Okay, so I'm seeing more discussion. I'm probably way behind on this with the Disney Family 515. And if you want to reach out to me at clubcubase at steinberg.de. So, you need to make sure that you're, and you may be getting this further in the discussion. I know I'm behind, but make sure that your Yamaha keyboard is connected to the computer via USB and that your CI your UR12 is connected. So they both need to be connected via USB. Okay. Okay, seeing more descriptions are getting it figured out. Thanks, Jazz Dude, for helping. Okay, so just going through. All right, I know we had some more questions that were sent in. We'll try to get through these. Thanks for everyone's patience. Okay, so it says when using the color palette, the palette disappears when I try to click on other section of track. So, the behavior of the color palette has changed, but I think if you just go to the project color setup, and I think if you just hit, I think it's Alt or Option Shift C, that this will bring this up. So Alt Option plus Shift and C. So now we can, I believe that color palette will just stay open. So I could say, let's come here, let's colorize this track. I want to take these tracks, make it that color, that won't disappear. So their question was, when using the color palette, the palette disappears when I try to click on another section of the track. So try just to make sure that you hit Alt Option plus Shift plus C. Okay, moving on to the other questions. Okay, so we had a question on Halion 6. I know that everyone doesn't have Halion 6, but maybe you can have the question in Hangout anyway if there's an answer to my question. When I undock a window, is there any tricks to have the undocked window still opened after closing the main Halion window? I kind of emailed some of our instrument planning department. I didn't hear back from them before the Hangout. I got this morning. But when we open up an instance of Halion, I'll just come over here. We'll just go to Halion 6 under my sampler. And this is kind of a cool feature that you could load up a particular instrument. And as we do that, we could undock different parts. So let's say if I have my, Haliotron instrument here and I wanted my macro, we could just undock that particular window and have that as a separate window. So I'll just try this again. So we'll choose undock. And now I could have kind of different parts of the program around. But when we kind of close the window, all of those will close. So the workaround, I think you may have come up with the same thing, is we could have, what we call like different window sets. So if we come here and we could just say, I just wanted to see only the macro, that way we could see only the particular function that you want. So you could have a condition set up, but I'll see if I could get an answer to maybe have those two windows independent of each other. Okay. So we had a question from Roger Hooper, a longtime friend and Cubase user. I'm going to start doing remote recording with a client vocalist. I've tried using the VST Connect where I was the artist and the engineer, had VST Connect app on his end. I downloaded VST Connect Performer. The latency was too bad to be able to use the system. We said our buffer is pretty low. What should I be looking at to control the latency besides the buffer settings. The person I will be working with is not tech savvy at all. So when you're doing a VST Connect recording, one thing I think that could help you out, Rogers, let's create that scenario here. So I'm going to create, we'll have our talk back mic, and this may seem counterintuitive, but we'll have our performer channel. So monitor this channel, but try to disable the monitor here, because as you kind of send the signal out, the signal gets sent out to them depending on the internet speed. And it'll be time aligned on their end. And then by the time it gets back to you, it's going to be time aligned. And I think if you have this on, you may hear it doubled. So try to disable this particular function here, the monitor on the track that you're remote recording. And I think that would help you out with that. All right, let's do one or two more questions. Thanks everyone for your patience. All right. All right. So seeing more discussion of the about the Yamaha keyboard. So I think, you still need to have a USB cable connected to that. Okay. Okay. So it says, "Hey, Greg, I have a project with several tracks in it. Is there a way of exporting them with separate track numbers? The songs make up one seamless piece of music." So if you do this, you could kind of do this with different track markers. So let's say if we have this song, I will add just a marker track here really quickly. And we could add cycle markers. So I'm just going to hold down my shift key. I think it's my option key. And let's say I'll just set my range here. And let's say this is like a live concert. And I'm going to add a cycle marker. So I'll set my range where I want the in and out to go, hit the letter P. And then I'm just going to add a cycle marker there. And let's say this is song 2, hit P, and then click on cycle marker song 3. Set the locators, and then we have our cycle marker. Now when I go to export my audio mixdown, at this point we click on cycle markers, and now when we do our export, each of those would be saved as separate files. Okay. Okay, so question, in the chord track, I don't find the C5. Well, technically a chord, and I've had discussions with this with many people, a chord is 3 separate notes, and often a C5 chord, while it's recognized in many guitar circles, isn't technically a chord because it has just the fifth and the octave. So, it would be a double stop. So that's why you don't see a C5 chord in the chord track. So it's not technically a chord. Okay, see if we could do like one more quick question, one or two more quick questions. We'll wrap up. Okay, I just lost my space. So, but I saw something about like white noise with the using a mouse, and sometimes you could run into that with I've seen some interference problems with that wireless mice can cause. All right, let me pick one last quick question. I know I'm like way behind. Sorry. Thanks for everyone's patience. Okay, let me just see if I could find where I was. Okay. Okay. I'll find just one last quick question. Okay, I see. I'm thinking of buying a large studio desk to work with Cubase. What can you recommend, please? Often desks can be very personal. I use an IKEA jerker, which I find works great for my needs. And I paid $200 for it. I think the output desks are pretty cool. I've seen those. I think it's a Italian company, Zaor. It looks pretty cool. So, but I try to keep everything very ergonomic for my settings, my setup. Okay, so we'll try this. Hi, Greg. Thank you for the hangout. Can you suggest to the dev team to make an option to have everything contained inside a folder when create a new project? Is that for the file management? If it's, you could set that from the, I'm not sure if you mean a folder track or if it's the folder for archiving the project. But once you define the folder in your setup here, when you go to file, new project, everything will get stored into that folder, but I'm not sure if I'm understanding it. All right, so we've gone for about 3 hours and 40 minutes. I'm going to go help out with my family stuff. My son's been incredibly patient, and I have to get my wife's birthday dinner organized. So I want to thank everyone for all the great questions that people asked. We'll be doing another hangout starting on Friday at 1 o'clock U.S. Eastern. If you have questions that you want to submit in advance, please feel free to send them to clubcubase@steinberg.de. If you get a chance, if you learned a new tip or trick, please feel free to give a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. And we'll see you guys on Friday. Thanks everyone for joining us, and please everyone stay safe and healthy during our current health crisis. And take this opportunity to learn more about Cubase and make some great music. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.